Welcome, if you dare. Today we will open the doors to a world where the horrors of the past meet the horrors of the present. Get ready to dive into the darkest and most mysterious corners of human fear, where nights of unknown pain become reality. Soon you will learn the truth about places where shadows come to life and darkness becomes dense like fog. Every sound, every shadow, and every whisper will bring you to the brink of madness. We will tell you about the dark secrets of the hospital, where the walls are saturated with suffering, and where every night is not just a night, the continuation of an endless nightmare. Get ready to hear the whispers of the dead, see creepy images, and immerse yourself in a world where fear becomes your reality. We hope that you realize that this path is not for the faint of heart, and remember that sometimes it's better not to know what's behind the doors you open. Please subscribe if you want to continue your descent into darkness. And don't forget to turn on notifications so that you don't miss a single horror story that will make your blood freeze with fear. The young nurse, Caitlin, has just started her new job in the psychiatric department of St. Luke's Hospital. Her whole career was just beginning, and she was full of enthusiasm and commitment to helping patients. However, the first night of her shift began with the fact that strange and frightening events began to occur in the department. At the beginning of her shift, Caitlin noticed that several doors in the hallway began to move on their own. First, they were slowly opened and then closed. At first, she thought it was just old doors that were poorly secured, but soon she began to hear strange noises. These sounds resembled whispers, as if someone was trying to say something, but was muffled. Periodically, there were even screams that could not be explained. When her fear subsided a little, Caitlin decided to investigate the source of the sounds. She entered one of the rooms where the noise seemed to be most intense. The ward looked like all the others, sterile and dreary. However, in the corner of the room, she noticed an old, dusty closet that caught her attention. In the closet, Caitlin found an old diary, which contained entries dated to the middle of the 20th century. Pages were filled with handwriting that was difficult to read due to old age, but Caitlin was able to make out the main points. The records described the horrific medical experiments carried out in this department, the torture the patients endured, and their subsequent disappearance. Caitlin, with a still fresh sense of novelty and anxiety, continued to flip through the pages of the diary. She found references to patients who had endured unimaginable torment. One entry, written in a shaky handwriting, caught her attention. "We continue here. They were not released, and now they are only looking for help." As she read more and more, Caitlin found notes about how some patients who were supposed to die had disappeared from the registry and never appeared again. Their names were disappearing, and no one could find any clues in their footsteps. These records were full of descriptions of the horrific medical procedures and experimental techniques that were used at the hospital, many of which clearly violated human rights and ethical norms. The more Caitlin read, the more anxious she became. One of the entries, written in a later handwriting, described scenes in which, after death, patients allegedly continued to live within the walls of the hospital, being chained to their torment. "We stay here, repeating our sufferings over and over again, because we were not released. Careful if you're reading this, because they might sense your presence." Caitlin was horrified, but decided to continue searching, hoping to find an explanation for what was happening. She put the diary back in its place and left the room. As soon as she closed the door, she heard the same whispers again, which now seemed even louder and clearer. The sounds began to become not only louder, but also more aggressive. In the hallway, doors began to open and close on their own, as if something invisible was playing with her perception. Suddenly, all the lights in the ward went out, and Caitlin was left in complete darkness. She could hear something moving around her and felt that someone invisible was watching her. She came across cold air coming from one of the wards, and heading there, saw that a strange nebula had appeared in the room. The fog began to slowly form into black shapes that seemed translucent and desiccated. These figures began to move towards Caitlin. Trying to stay calm, she noticed that their faces were twisted into painful grimaces. The shadows moved as if they were trying to pull their torments out and find peace. Caitlin felt her own breathing become rapid, and fear engulf her. As the figures approached, she saw that in their hands were scraps of clothing and personal items that she thought might belong to the missing patients. These images were full of pain and fear, and every scream was like a knife thrust into her mind. Caitlin, trapped in the darkness and terrifying silence, felt her fear turn to panic. For every movement, every sound seemed to be pursued by unknown forces. Trying to keep her mind, she began to look for a way to get out of the ward. Suddenly, she felt that someone was watching her. Her heart began to pound in her chest when she heard the creaking of footsteps that seemed to be following her. But when she turned around, she saw no one. The screeching sound started coming from the room she was heading to again. It was a sound like a child sobbing, and it was getting louder. Strange images began to appear in the corridor, where there had been complete silence before. The light from her flashlight, which she held in her hands, fell on the walls, and Caitlin noticed that strange, distorted shapes began to appear on them. They were blurred outlines of human faces and hands, as if someone was trying to break through the walls. These figures were not clear, but they looked as if they were covered with a crust of old mold and dried blood. Caitlin decided to check where these sounds were coming from and noticed that the doors of one of the wards had opened slightly. There was only a tiny glowing spot from the lamp inside, and scraps of medical documents and old records lay on the floor. Suddenly, she noticed that something was moving in the room. There was a seat on the chair in the corner, and at this time it seemed that the chair began to grind and move on its own. Her gaze fell on the floor, where there were scraps of clothing as well as personal hygiene items and accessories that should have been disposed of long ago. Caitlin felt her breathing getting heavier as she noticed that the things that once belonged to the patients had begun to move. The shadows from her flashlight seemed to come to life and become sinister figures that crawled across the floor and walls, moving from corner to corner. Suddenly, Caitlin felt her hands begin to shake, and she noticed that the temperature in the room had dropped sharply. The cold was so penetrating that it penetrated through her uniform. In this icy darkness, she saw a strange, barely visible light coming from under an old table. Lifting the lid, she found several dark spots that looked like dried blood, and something even scarier, photographs depicting horrific medical experiments and grim scenes. Each photo showed scenes that should have remained outside reality. The faces of patients who are distorted in horror, medical instruments that were clearly used for torture. Looking at these images was so shocking that Caitlin felt her consciousness begin to blur. Unable to stand it any longer, she screamed, and at that moment the lamp went out, leaving her in complete darkness. Suddenly she heard clear whispers that were now close and could be discerned. They sounded like desperate pleas for help and a threatening warning. "They won't let you go. You have to leave, or you will stay here forever." Whispers penetrated her consciousness. Caitlin, in total darkness, felt her fear reach unbearable heights. Suddenly, an eerie sound like a whisper came from under the table, and turning around, she saw that the shadows on the walls had begun to take the form of human faces. These faces were distorted in horror and suffering, and it seemed that they were suffering from unimaginable horror. When Caitlin tried to move, she noticed that the floor beneath her began to slowly become stained with fresh blood, which suddenly began to ooze from cracks in the walls. The blood was thick and dark, and when it touched her legs, she felt her legs begin to lose sensation.